A simple detail, an invisible clue to everyone, was the key that revealed the truth behind a case that seemed closed. How did a small hint that no one considered change everything we thought we knew? I'm going to tell you. It was just another day at the morgue in Montevideo when we received a body that, at first, seemed like a common case. A man found dead under unclear circumstances, and the crime scene pointed to an accident, but something didn't quite fit. As a forensic doctor, I always look for those details that others overlook, and this time, microscopic evidence made all the difference. Before we start, let me know in the comments where you're watching this video from, so I can see how far it has reached. My name is Luis Padron. I'm 38 years old, and I have worked as a forensic doctor here in Montevideo, Uruguay, for almost a decade. Every body that arrives is a closed book, a story I must tell accurately. In this case, the pressure wasn't just about solving the mystery, but about correcting a mistaken interpretation that had gained traction and could ruin justice. The man had been found in his home, with no obvious signs of violence. The police believed it was an accident due to a fall. The scene supported this hypothesis. But I felt something was missing. Something small, almost invisible, that could change everything. I decided to carefully review every detail of the body, to look beyond the obvious. What I saw after hours of concentration was something nobody in the initial investigation had noticed. A tiny stain, almost imperceptible at the base of the left thumb. A strange residue that at first glance was mistaken for normal dirt. But that minimal clue led me to connect the pieces of the puzzle. What for many was just a closed case, for me became a challenge that required patience and a critical eye. I discovered that small detail hid the real truth. It wasn't an accidental fall, but an attempt to cover up a crime. That minimal evidence was a thread that, when pulled, unraveled the entire lie. In this video, I want to share with you how that evidence went unnoticed, how I changed the course of the investigation, and why learning to notice those details can make the difference between truth and lies. It wasn't easy or quick, but every second spent looking beyond the obvious was worth it. Join me on this journey where I will reveal not only the story behind the case, but also the lessons it left me for a lifetime as a forensic doctor. Every body has a hidden truth, and sometimes that truth lies in what nobody wants to see. Are you ready to discover how a small detail could change everything? Then stay with me. The scene was, at first glance, just another one of the many that one ends up witnessing in my profession. A lifeless body, a familiar situation, a new case to solve, and a key story to unravel. However, from the moment I arrived at the scene, I felt that something was not quite right. It wasn't just about the body, nor about the apparent cause of death suggested by the initial reports. Something in the environment, in the way the scene had been handled, and in the arrangement of the evidence caught my attention. As I began the autopsy, I noticed that everything seemed orderly, almost too much so. The body did not show obvious signs of extreme violence, nor macroscopic alterations that could immediately explain the cause of death. What there were, however, were small details, almost insignificant, that could go unnoticed by anyone who did not fix their gaze and focus all their attention. A small injury on the skin, a barely visible mark on the scalp, a slight discoloration in tissue adjacent to the heart. Elements that could, at first glance, seem like observational errors or simply irrelevant. But for me, who has spent years looking at and analyzing bodies to tell their stories, they were signs that I could not ignore. Carefully, I decided to extend the study, requesting additional tests that are usually not ordered in simple cases like this. I asked to analyze tissue samples under the microscope with specific stains that are not routine and patiently awaited the results. Meanwhile, I reviewed every document, every police report, every witness statement that could help me understand what had happened minutes before death. But something didn't fit, and that feeling grew with each passing hour. When the first laboratory results arrived, my initial suspicion was confirmed. There were microscopic traces of uncommon chemical substances in the body, substances which, although in minimal quantities, seemed to have triggered the fatal event. This made me think of a slow, silent, almost imperceptible poisoning. But the curious thing was that not even in the victim's environment had there been specific searches for these substances, much less had it been considered that someone might have had access to that poison. In other words, the entire judicial process was starting from a flawed basis. My work began to focus on two fronts. On one hand, hard science, applying precise protocols and repeating tests to ensure there was no margin for error. On the other, collaboration with the authorities to reconsider the case hypothesis, to reopen lines of investigation that had been discarded as irrelevant. Challenging the official version was complicated because it implies questioning not only beliefs but also procedures that may be too rigid. But after so many years in this profession, I learned that my duty is to the truth, to that body that guides me to tell its story, no matter how difficult it is to twist established protocols. One of the most challenging parts was convincing the investigators to bring to light evidence that no one had seen or had simply decided to ignore. A small particle adhered to the victim's clothing, imperceptible to most, was the key that completely changed the direction of the investigation. Analyzing it took days, involved collaborations with other specialists, and a patience that seemed infinite, but it was worth it. That particle contained elements that linked the case to people and places initially considered unrelated to the event. Thus, we opened a door that no one had expected, and the case took on increasingly complex and dangerous dimensions. Days passed, and my obsession with leaving no detail to chance led me to work tirelessly, almost isolated in the laboratory, mentally reviewing every moment, every finding, every small clue. Just when I thought it was impossible to find new information, I reviewed once again one of the scene photographs. The angle, the lighting, and the context of the object found did not match the witness's version. There was a small, almost unnoticeable contradiction that set off an alarm in my head. Without hesitation, I proposed return to the site to collect new evidence, hoping to find something that would completely dismantle all previous hypotheses. The second visit to the incident site was tense. The pressure grew, not only due to the case's complexity, but because doubts and tensions began to arise between those conducting the police investigation and those seeking the truth from my forensic position. We were on unstable ground, where every step had to be carefully measured not to ruin evidence or alter the case's perception. However, thanks to everyone's tenacity, we managed to identify new particles and traces, and what seemed impossible began to clear up. The minimal evidence that no one had considered was right there, holding a secret that would forever change the interpretation of the facts. As the investigation progressed, we began to see the whole picture. There were those who had manipulated the scene, trying to cover up the true cause of death and divert attention toward a false story. I realized that behind that small ignored detail lay a much deeper plot of interests and secrets that could change not only the victim's fate, but also the experience of several people involved. That revelation made me understand the scope of forensic work. It's not only about analyzing bodies, but about unraveling the invisible layers of reality that at first glance seem simple. The process was slow, meticulous, and exhausting, but also exciting because I felt that each new piece of data brought us closer to the truth. My colleagues and I plunged into a parallel investigation among histologies, toxicological analyses, and digital reconstructions, combining technology and human experience, so that no detail was left out. But what caught my attention most was the reaction of those who initially dismissed those clues. Many did not want to accept that they had overlooked something so crucial, and that resistance itself was another aspect of the case to handle with care. Suddenly, the case went from being just another to becoming an invaluable lesson from my career. I learned that attention to detail is not just good practice. It is essential to guarantee justice, to honor those who can no longer tell their story for themselves. Patience became an indispensable virtue, because in this type of work, haste is the enemy of truth, and concentration, a vital tool that can be the difference between a fatal error and a revolutionary finding. As I shared these advances with other professionals, I realized that in forensic medicine, the public recognition of the merit of small details is often scarce. Society tends to focus on high-profile cases, on great tragedies or media trials. But behind every body, behind every death, there's a universe of hidden information, secrets waiting to be discovered, which only a careful eye, a restless mind, and a committed heart can reveal. This case marked me not only because of its technical complexity, but because it taught me never to underestimate the power of the invisible. From those minimal evidences that at first glance seem irrelevant can arise the greatest answers. And it is precisely there where forensic responsibility lies, in always maintaining the firmness to seek the truth without being swayed by appearances or external pressure, which often wants to hasten processes and close cases prematurely. As the case moved toward its final resolution, conflicting feelings also grew within me. On one hand, the satisfaction of having changed the course of an investigation that seemed lost. On the other, unease thinking about how many other times something similar might have happened, how many hidden truths sleep under human laziness or prejudice. I thought of those colleagues working under difficult conditions, without resources or with little support, and I understood even more the importance of our work as guardians of the body and ultimately of justice. But perhaps the most impactful was recognizing that behind it all is the human story of a person who deserves to be heard. It was not just another case on my list. It was a life crying out to be understood in its entirety. That evidence no one considered allowed me to reconstruct their last chapter with respect and dignity, and reminded me that although we are part of scientific discipline, our work is nourished by each unique story that we put into words based on what the body reveals to us. I will never forget the night I finished closing the file, with the peace of mind of having done my duty well. I knew that minimal evidence had not only changed the judicial fate of the case, but also reaffirmed to me something fundamental. Patience, concentration, and attention to detail are not just tools. They are the pillars of a work that seeks to rescue the truth amidst complexity, darkness, and sometimes indifference. And so, in the stillness of the laboratory, with dim lights and silence broken only by the faint hum of the equipment, I concluded that every body is an open book only for those willing to look beyond, to wait as long as necessary, and not let even the smallest evidence slip away. Because in that tiny forgotten fragment may lie the answer that changes everything. And that lesson, more than technical, is a life teaching that I have carried with me ever since that I remember perfectly how, after that second visit to the scene, I returned to the laboratory with a mix of physical exhaustion and a mind that wouldn't stop revolving around every detail we had found. It was at that moment that I realized the case had ceased to be merely routine and had become a personal and professional challenge that would demand something more. That almost obsessive perseverance that one sometimes develops after years in this profession. I re-entered all the pieces of the puzzle. The microscopic evidence, the renewed photographs, the statements reviewed over and over again, in search of patterns or contradictions that initial anxiety and fatigue might have obscured. During those long hours, as daylight gave way to dusk, I began working with the samples we had collected and that, until then, had not been fully interpreted. Something caught my attention. A subtle anomaly in the chemical composition of the particle adhered to the clothing. It was an organic compound that didn't appear anywhere known at the scene, nor in previous reports. I began relating that compound to residues found on other parts of the body, and little by little, the idea that we were dealing with a deeper manipulation began to take shape. It was not simply an accident, nor a natural death disguised by negligence. There was an intervention seeking to hide a much darker truth. The tension in the air was palpable, not only in me but throughout the entire team now involved. Some colleagues, initially skeptical about the complexity it presented, began to show interest. Suddenly, the dynamic changed and the routine turned into a race against time, not only to clarify the case but to stop something that could get out of control if action wasn't swift. The seemingly disconnected pieces began to fit into a scenario that involved people who, until then, were considered innocent or mere bystanders. That night, as I reviewed the images again under low light, I found myself observing an almost imperceptible pattern in the fibers of the victim's clothing. That small particle, which at first had seemed insignificant, contained traces of materials used in specific industrial environments, places that appear to have no direct relation to the victim's daily life. The contrast seemed so strangely disconnected that I decided to delve deeper into that line of inquiry, contacting experts in environmental toxicology as well as colleagues who could work with advanced spectrometry and trace analysis techniques. Thus, the case expanded from a standard autopsy to an almost multidisciplinary framework where science and detective work complemented each other. But what really complicated matters was the growing feeling that someone else was watching our every move. Shortly after sending samples for external analysis, rumors began circulating. Small unofficial leaks aimed at discrediting the investigation or distracting the investigators. I considered the possibility that someone was trying to protect hidden interests, and I couldn't help but feel that my work not only threatened an established theory, but also the safety of everyone involved. That mix of adrenaline and responsibility made me more cautious, reviewing every protocol and ensuring no evidence was compromised. Between calls and meetings, a question kept resurfacing in my mind. How many times had evidence like this been overlooked in other cases? How many secrets lie hidden in bodies no one took the time to examine patiently? Every answer seemed to open a new question, and as the investigation brought to light new discrepancies, it became clear that the plot was bigger and more complex than anyone had imagined. What began as a seemingly simple case of death from no apparent cause was now entangled with interests, power, and, unfortunately, silent complicity. But it was not the moment to lose sight of the objective, the truth. So, with full concentration, the forensic work continued, not allowing external pressure to alter the scientific course of the investigation. We consulted specialists in various fields, addressing every doubt that arose, from environmental contaminant analysis to forensic reinterpretation of biological phenomena in the body. Reconstructing the victim's last day required not only usual rigor, but also maximum creativity and openness to consider uncommon scenarios that other less meticulous investigations might have quickly discarded, perhaps with irreversible consequences. Each new result seemed to confirm what we suspected. The death was neither accidental nor natural, but induced by a controlled substance which, although present in minute quantities, had triggered an irreversible organ failure. However, the next step was not only scientific, but judicial and social. This minimal evidence revealed the existence of a network of complicity and lies that, until then, had managed to remain in the shadows. The challenge was not only to clarify the mechanics of the event, but to prepare the ground so that the judicial system could act firmly and thoroughly. The pressure increased day by day, and at times I felt the weight of the responsibility this investigation represented. I could not afford to fail or allow the truth to be buried by superficiality or the comfort of previous conclusions. There were moments when the emotional weight of the story hit me hard. I never forgot that behind each piece of data, behind every applied science, there was a person, a family seeking answers. That awareness kept me firm, insisting that patience and meticulousness had to guide the entire process. I recall one particular night, while waiting for the final results of one of those special analyses involving cutting-edge technology, when I felt a strange mixture of anxiety and hope. The investigation had reached a point where every move could have a significant impact, for better or worse. However, I knew time was both ally and enemy. Too fast, and some details might be missed. Too slow, and the opportunity to intervene while still possible would be lost. Finally, when I had in my hands a complete report certifying the presence and exact composition of that toxic agent, the feeling was bittersweet. On one hand, the satisfaction of having uncovered the truth. On the other, the certainty of the impact it would have on all lives involved, not only for the justice that needed to be served, but for the wounds and divisions opened in the process. But above all, the conviction that this minimal evidence, which no one had initially considered, had made the difference between maintaining a lie or revealing the truth in all its depth. What followed was a difficult process to make the authorities understand the magnitude of finding. There was resistance, doubts, conflicting interests. It was not just a resolution of a case, but a confrontation with a system that often seeks shortcuts, that fears destabilizing established certainties. However, it was my duty to insist, not only as a forensic doctor, but as someone who fervently believes in justice and the power of truth to transform realities. So every meeting, every presentation, every detail exposed represented a step forward, and no discomfort or resistance would make me back down. That case taught me that forensic work is not limited to science or medical diagnosis. It is, above all, a journey into human complexity, into truths hidden out of fear, negligence, or interests. And that the key lies in not taking anything for granted, in knowing how to listen to what the body tries to say, even when the voice is so faint it almost seems non-existent. The minimal evidence not only changed the meaning of that specific case, but also reconnected me with the very essence of my profession. The relentless pursuit of truth, even if it takes time, requires dismantling prejudices and challenges the status quo. As I think about all that investigation revealed and how, from a tiny, almost invisible particle, it was possible to unravel a story of manipulation and tragedy. My conviction is now even stronger. The true value of forensic work lies in patience, concentration, and attention to detail. Those tools that sometimes seem slow or tedious are actually the engine that drives justice and respect for life. Because behind every body is a unique story, full of nuances, and only those who stop to listen to that story in all its complexity can bring the truth to light, no matter how minimal the evidence on which it rests. As a forensic doctor, I will never forget how that experience pushed me to stand firm in the face of adversity, made me question my own certainties, and above all reaffirmed that the work we do holds a transcendent value for people and society. The story behind that forgotten particle was no longer just a closed case. It was a warning, a call for perseverance and the utmost care we must take in our work, a constant reminder that in science and justice, nothing is too small to be ignored. And that truth, despite darkness and resistance, always finds its way when there are eyes and hands willing to seek it tirelessly. The following weeks turned into a tunnel of uncertainty and small victories. Every piece of data we gathered was another part of that puzzle, which at first glance seemed simple, but whose assembly required an unfailing eye and an unbreakable will. I remember more than once feeling like I was moving forward and backward at the same time, as if every answer opened new, more complex and profound questions. The uncertainty grew more intense when we noticed that someone was closely watching our steps, and this idea stopped being a hypothesis after a couple of unexpected events. One day, when I arrived at a laboratory, I found certain samples that we had stored under perfect conditions disorganized, something unthinkable under our protocol. There were no obvious signs of tampering, no trace indicating an outside presence, but the certainty that something had changed immediately raised an alert. The team looked at each other with distrust, as if trying to guess whether someone had been careless or if we were facing a more elaborate sabotage. The pressure grew, and far from paralyzing us, it made us more careful and methodical, which in turn led us to discover events that had until then gone unnoticed. It was in one of those moments that one of the technicians urgently called me, pointing out a new detail in the fibers we had analyzed. There was an almost exact correspondence between those suspicious particles and the residues found in an industrial machine at a local chemical plant. That connection was not only unexpected, but opened a direct window to a scenario where the victim, an apparently ordinary person outside that world, had been exposed in an environment nobody suspected, and, worse still, under circumstances that were anything but accidental. We began investigating that industrial environment, gaining access through contacts with the police and public records. The plant in question had a series of strict protocols, but also a history of complaints about poor environmental management and opaque practices. As we gathered information, a picture emerged in which not only the workplace conditions or safety were compromised, but also a network of cover-ups and pressures limited the possibility of certain realities becoming public. Here, the engineering of lies took place not only at the crime scene, but also within the social and political frameworks surrounding everything. One of the most unexpected twists happened when, while reviewing an old inspection report, I found an almost illegible note in the margin indicating possible cross-contamination in the area where the victim was last seen. That led us to request records of movements and correspondences from the plant, a task that began to fill me with anxiety as every step meant overcoming administrative obstacles and veiled threats. However, the team stayed focused. This time, it was not only about clarifying the mechanics of death, but about dismantling a system of cover-ups that could be putting more people at risk. The judicial investigation advanced slowly, while we continued facing tight-lipped silences and evasive explanations from those managing the plant. It happened that, at a crucial moment, one of the experts who had collaborated with us was called to testify, and shortly afterwards suffered an accident that abruptly ended his participation. It was a clear warning of the tension in the air and that we were not alone in this search. Someone else was willing to do anything to keep this truth from coming to light. But that shadow of threat only sharpened our commitment. With each new report or testimony, the complexity increased. We began identifying patterns of repeated negligence over the years, linked to a system that tolerated or even encouraged certain irresponsibilities. I realized that the small compound we had detected had a chemical origin with insidious properties, and that its presence in the body had not only triggered a brutal organic failure, but also indicated prolonged and repeated contact. That revelation was chilling, as it suggested the victim had been systematically exposed in their closest environment without anyone really noticing. A decisive moment came through a meeting with a plant worker who agreed to speak on condition of anonymity. His account was devastating. He explained how certain protocols were ignored to speed up processes, how management actively concealed incidents, and above all, how pressure was exerted to silence those who observed irregularities. That confession, which we adapted legally to protect his identity, was a ray of light that confirmed many of our suspicions and reinforced a hypothesis of an induced death, a direct consequence of preventable and concealed toxic exposure. As we reconstructed the victim's last day with the help of testimonies, records, technical reports, and scientific analyses, the picture began to take shape with unwavering clarity. It was not simply an accident, not a whim of fate, but the result of a network with a contradiction between reality and appearances was brutal. The minimal evidence had become a truth so expansive that it questioned not only a particular case, but social patterns founded on impunity. That feeling of stirring up mud in the open was overwhelming. But right there was the ethical and professional commitment that sustained me. At the end of one of those endless days of analysis and debates with experts, I stood alone in front of the microscope. I observed that particle, small and almost invisible, but with a monumental impact. At that moment, I understood something essential. The story that fragment told was a reflection of a reality fragmented by interests, fears, and taboos. It was not enough to understand the what and how of the death. It was necessary to open a space for dialogue and renewal involving all actors, from science to the affected community. Forensic medicine was not just a cold science, but a tool to heal, to dignify those who could no longer speak. External pressure grew alongside our progress. These were times marked by tense meetings, legal consultations, and a constant struggle to maintain the independence and rigor of the process. More than once, I felt how temptations and threats mingle with attempts to discredit our work. However, thanks to the team's commitment, we were able to shield every piece of evidence, review it 1,000 times, subject it to new tests, and contrast every data point as if our own credibility depended on it. That attitude was essential to maintain the line between truth and the distortions that others wanted to impose. I confess there were moments when I questioned how worthwhile it was to keep going. The emotional burden was considerable. Before me was not just a victim, but a family shattered by suffering and a community awakening to a harsh and complex reality. The responsibility was both scientific and human, because every advance had consequences beyond the laboratory and official records. However, it was that very dimension that drove me, the certainty that truth is not just an abstract ideal, but a tangible form of justice and respect. Finally, after months of tireless work, we found ourselves on the threshold of closing the expert phase. We knew that the evidence had changed the course of the case, that the official narrative could no longer stand against concrete and verified facts. However, we also understood that the battle did not end there. That finding would open revision processes, challenge structures, and give voice to those silenced for too long. It was a bittersweet moment, marked by professional satisfaction and the sadness that comes with facing the magnitude of exposed injustices. I want you to imagine, as I did, the weight of holding in your hand a report where every word was backed by rigorous science, but also by the conviction that this minimal evidence would be the foundation for truth to emerge powerfully. The mix of emotions was immense: pride, fear, conviction, and above all, deep gratitude for being able to do what truly matters in our profession. Beyond recognition, the fundamental lesson was understanding that in our hands lies immense power and responsibility that transcends technique. It is a commitment to life, justice, and memory. Now, thinking of everything that case meant, I realized that the smallest piece can trigger reactions far greater than one might imagine. What seemed an insignificant detail, a simple forgotten particle, ended up becoming the key that opened a closed paradise of secrets, fears, and silences. And here lies the essence of forensic work, and the reason why we must never underestimate the importance of every clue, no matter how small it seems, because within it may reside the power to change the course of a hidden truth. My experience has taught me that the true challenge is not finding a quick solution, but holding the gaze on complexity, resisting the pressure to overlook the uncomfortable and maintaining scientific integrity despite all adversities. That patience, concentration, and a keen eye are the most valuable tools we have to honor those who seek justice through us. That, in reality, our work transcends the laboratory boundaries, entering the realm of profound human commitment. This story, which began with the examination of a body and a tiny particle, ended up being a mirror reflecting the shadows and lights of our society, because it reminds us that behind every death there is a story that deserves to be heard, and that only those of us who dedicate our lives to science with honesty and dedication can give voice to those stories that darkness seeks to bury, that small and silent truth, yet resilient, which perseveres until it emerges with all its strength to demand justice. And now, as I take stock, I feel a conviction that this investigation left an indelible mark on my career and on how I understand my role as a forensic doctor. Everything, absolutely everything, can change if one looks closely enough, if one does not forget that the truth is there, waiting to be discovered in the smallest evidence, in the whisper of the body silently crying out. That is the essence of the commitment we must always uphold. Thus, in the echo of that experience, a restlessness settles with me to this day. How many cases, how many lives have been desecrated by indifference or haste? How many truths still wait, patient and small, to be found? That is why I will continue insisting, searching, questioning, trusting that with patience, rigor, and respect, we can turn every particle into a beacon that lights the way for justice. Because if I learned anything from that evidence no one considered, it is that within the smallest proof may lie the truth that will change the fate of many. And that is a truth we're protecting tirelessly. The feeling that we were dealing with something much deeper than a simple forensic analysis intensified with each new finding, but also with every small setback we faced. It wasn't just that the case was becoming more complicated. It was that we found ourselves in the middle of a labyrinth where the walls shifted, where certainties quickly turned into doubts, and where external pressure became a constant shadow. I clearly remember one of those nights in the laboratory when only a few of us remained. That particle was still under my microscope, and upon closer examination, I noticed something I had missed before. It was impregnated not only with an unusual chemical compound, but also with organic remains from a plant species that was not found inside the factory or its immediate surroundings. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible clue, but one with crucial significance. The place where the victim had spent their last hours could not have been limited to just inside the plant. It had to include a bordering area which, according to official maps, was protected and off-limits to the general public. That new piece of information opened a parallel line of investigation that forced us to reconsider the chronology of events. It was not only about determining how and why the victim had suffered that massive poisoning, but also about unraveling what had led them to that forbidden place, and what or who had put them there at such a critical moment. Initial testimonies from co-workers and family members, which at first seemed coherent and aligned with the accident theory, began to clash with small contradictions and silences that now took on a different meaning. We knew that the victim had been in contact with people who might have had interests in keeping certain activities inside and outside the plant hidden. We dove into reviewing hours of security camera footage, access requests, visitor logs, and even phone messages that had been turned over by court order. Every document, every video pixel, seemed loaded with secrets. And it was precisely during one of those analyses that an unexpected twist appeared. An unregistered visitor had been on the premises a few days before the fatal event. They were neither an employee nor a regular contractor, and their presence seemed to have no logical justification. When we tried to follow that lead, bureaucracy and roadblocks increased. Plant personnel became evasive, local authorities grew suspicious, and to top it off, subtle threats aimed at our team appeared, seeking to discourage us from continuing the investigation. However, far from weakening us, those circumstances created in us a kind of silent communion, a stubborn determination not to let those threats be a break. Each day was a meticulous, almost obsessive process in which we cross-checked data repeatedly, sometimes frustrated by the slowness, but never willing to give up. It was precisely amid that whirlwind that I decided to redouble my efforts and make a nod to my personal experience. I re-inspected the body myself, thinking that perhaps in those seemingly insignificant details that everyone overlooked, I might find a definitive key. And I was not wrong. In the detailed examination, small, almost imperceptible marks reappeared on areas of the body previously believed to have no relevant wounds. It was nothing obvious at first glance, but the pattern, when compared with previous reports of chemical exposures and forced contacts, showed something different. Evidence that the victim had been exposed not only to toxic substances, but also to a directed force that had physically restrained them, leaving them vulnerable to biochemical damage. That evidence, no matter how minimal it seemed, disrupted the accident narrative to open the door to the possibility of an intentional act, an assault with a clear intent to cause harm. Taking that interpretation into the judicial arena was a complex process in itself. Lawyers defending powerful interests attempted to discredit the validity of those small marks with technical and dilatory arguments, claiming they could result from natural movements or the handling of the body post-mortem. In response, we reinforce the analyses with complementary expertise, incorporating occupational toxicology and biomechanics experts, who confirmed the interpretation that it was not only a chemical accident, but also a deliberate act to deprive the victim of defensive and survival possibilities. That association turned the minimal piece of evidence into compelling proof capable of dismantling the web of lies that had been erected. As judicial proceedings continued, the pressure shifted to other spheres. The media began to take increasing interest in the case, but also with sensationalism that complicated the clear, precise communication we needed to maintain to avoid manipulation. Some saw in this story an opportunity to question the entire industrial system and its failures, while others tried to minimize it to preserve the image of powerful entities. Amid that noise, the team wisely chose to keep a low yet firm profile and let the technical evidence speak for itself without succumbing to simplistic narratives. It was a decisive meeting convened at the prosecutor's office, where one of the most impactful accounts came to light. The anonymous worker who had agreed to talk weeks earlier finally gave their testimony officially, protected by special measures. With a broken but resolute voice, they described the daily reality of an environment contaminated by fear and complicity, a place where silence was costly, and those responsible preferred to look the other way even when people's safety and lives hung by an invisible thread. Their words not only confirmed our hypotheses, but also added a human dimension to the case, one that cannot be quantified but weighs more than any chemical substance. What followed was a combination of legal maneuvers, parallel investigations, and precautionary measures at the plant. Public pressure grew, and little by little, the walls of silence began to crack. Some previous complaints that had been archived were reopened, and more testimonies from workers who dared to break the omerta chain that had prevailed for years appeared. The authorities, although reluctant, began to show signs of acting more rigorously, driven not only by legal reasons but also by public opinion and the incontrovertible science we had in our hands. In our day-to-day laboratory work, the pace remained intense, but there was also something deeper motivating our efforts. The certainty that we were setting a precedent, not just for that particular case, but for the forensic and judicial community throughout the region. We knew that with every meticulous analysis, with every carefully prepared report, we were affirming a crucial principle. No evidence is too small. No lead is irrelevant when it is working to illuminate a hidden truth. It was a message that transcended the case, a call for discipline, ethical commitment, and the infinite patience of scientists. But the complexity also meant that the line between hope and frustration was very thin. On more than one occasion, we found ourselves repeating procedures, trying to salvage details that at first seemed lost, reconstructing hypotheses when others were refuted. This emotional roller coaster not only affected the team, it also impacted us personally. I learned that strength is built on that dense ground where despair tries to creep in, and that the work of the forensic specialist, beyond the technique, is to uphold the dignity of truth in the face of adversity. One of those evenings, almost at the point of exhaustion, I received an urgent message from one of our lead technicians. An external laboratory had detected an exact match between the chemical profile of our particle and an experimental compound known only by a very select group inside the industry, with a confidential history in experimentation. That was an unexpected twist that placed the case in an even more delicate and expansive dimension. The implication was clear. The victim had unknowingly been linked to something much larger, a scientific industrial web operating in the shadows, without public oversight and with potentially lethal risks. We then decided to redouble discretion and expand our network of contacts with external experts and international organizations, aware that this transcended borders and local contexts. The interdisciplinary collaboration not only enriched our perspective, but also provided new analytical tools to trace the exact origin of that substance and its mode of action. Nervousness grew, as every advance challenged structures that preferred confidentiality, but it was also a reaffirmation of the power of science when the smallest pieces become compelling evidence. As I found myself immersed in those complex and little-traveled territories, I paused to reflect on how it had all started. A simple detail, an invisible speck among thousands, a piece of evidence that only a patient eye and an alert mind could find and connect. That realization filled me with humility and reminded me that the work inside and outside the laboratory goes far beyond technical rigor. It is an act of faith in justice, truth, and human dignity. If I ever doubted the impact of minimal evidence, that case proved beyond doubt that a fragment, a particle, a tiny signal can be the key that displaces entire mountains of lies, complicity, or negligence. Up to this point, the story seemed to be nearing closure, but I knew deep inside that there were still chapters yet to be written, because the investigation not only had to resolve the mechanics of that death, but also serve as a precedent, so that other cases would not be overshadowed by omission or fear. The truth emerging there was powerful and at the same time fragile. It was an ecosystem that had to be protected, responsibly disclosed, and that required those of us who bear scientific commitment to stand firm, even when the evidence placed us in the eye of political, economic, or social storms. And so, while supporting the affected family in their process of grief and pursuit of justice, I understood that the true impact of our work is not measured solely by condemnatory trials or technical reports. What remains is the mark we leave on the system, on the collective conscience, on how our society acknowledges or ignores the deep causes that lead to those tragedies. Forensic medicine, far from being an isolated and cold discipline, can be an agent of change, a beacon for those who have no voice, and an indispensable tool for historical memory. At the end of that experience, I felt that a part of me had changed. I no longer viewed the work with the same innocence or naivety. I understood that the body, that open book we study, is also a silent archivist of injustices, that each tissue, every chemical trace, every mark has behind it a story, a truth that can transform precise realities, or at least force them to be seen with new eyes. I learned that there is no minimal evidence, only minimal attention, and that the patience to sustain attention is the engine of justice, not hurried, but forged over time with rigor and respect. Despite everything, that particle no one considered was, in the end, the spark that lit a flame revealing dark places where others dared not look. And that feeling of having changed someone's story even with a single piece of evidence, with a single act of attention, is the drive that inspires me to keep going. Because in this work, which sometimes seems small or invisible, lies the greatest power. To give voice to truth, no matter how small, until it becomes an irrevocable call for justice. And that, my friends, is the truth I carry with me and want to share with you. From the moment we confirmed the connection between that experimental substance and the evidence found, a much more complex and, at the same time, dangerous web unfolded before us. The secret dimension of that substance implied that we were not merely facing a loose thread within an industrial process, but a hidden network with scientific, economic, and political implications far beyond what any forensic report could cover. However, instead of intimidating us, this challenge forced us to dig even deeper with greater rigor, aware that every hour spent unraveling the truth could translate into saving future lives, or exposing reality behind similar tragedies. One early morning, when exhaustion seemed to have reached its peak and fatigue made my eyes struggle to stay open, I received an unexpected call. It was a colleague from another country, an expert in chemical substances with an impeccable reputation, who had worked on cases that, like ours, involved little documented experimental compounds. He spoke to us with a mixture of concern and admiration. What you are facing is not one of those common cases of occupational contamination. This bears the mark of a clandestine experiment, an unregulated trial, and the victim was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He confessed that such findings were usually subject to systematic cover-ups and bureaucracies that buried the clues. However, he also acknowledged that the evidence we had managed to gather was solid, too solid to be ignored. That call not only reinforced the importance of the work we were doing, but also immersed us in the reality of what it meant to be forensic experts in situations where the truth confronted powerful interests. We began designing a careful strategy to protect both the investigation and the safety of the team. We knew that at any moment we could become targets of more explicit pressures, not only verbal threats, but possible maneuvers intended to derail the truth. But we decided there was no turning back. The thorough analysis of the particle not only provided data on its composition, but also revealed possible exposure routes and mechanisms of action on the human body. We detected that the compound had a synergistic effect with other substances the victim had come into contact with, which amplified the toxicity and could explain the abrupt speed of their deterioration. Laboratory tests showed that it was not simply a poison derived from usual environmental exposure, but a chemical manipulation pointing to a possible attempt to mask deliberate action. In other words, the victim was not only affected by an accidental toxic agent, but that same agent was used to cause harm without showing typical patterns of physical violence at first. The search for this enigma led us to review the plant's records even more exhaustively, and little by little, aspects previously hidden under dense layers of indifference and fear began to come to light. We found documents suggesting opaque internal protocols and, in some cases, reports of minor incidents that were never thoroughly investigated. The feeling was desolate. The victim's vulnerability had been not only physical but also administrative and social. The worst part was that this situation was not an isolated incident, but indicative of a sick system that had allowed recurring risks without adequate measures. Amid all this, an unexpected turn altered the course of the investigation. A casual conversation I had with a veteran member of the plant's cleaning crew led me to a testimony that had remained buried in a corner of collective memory. He spoke of a restricted room accessible only to a few, where some of the most dangerous compounds were stored, and where, according to him, unusual movements had occurred during the week of the incident. His account not only matched that borderline area marked by the presence of plant residues that initially caught our attention, but also linked to a figure we had not considered until then, a supervisor who, for reasons beginning to take shape, seemed to have motives to keep certain operations secret. Working on this new lead, we discovered that the supervisor had altered records and authorized entries without protocol during the critical days. The tacit or active complicity of some people inside the plant began to emerge as an essential part of the mosaic. Beyond the victim, we faced a web where questionable interests not only tolerated but facilitated lethal risks. That truth, which at first was mere suspicion, was now anchored in concrete evidence and demanded legal and social consequences. Perhaps one of the most difficult moments for me and the team came when the victim's family, confronted with so much news and expectation, asked us to try to show the human dimension behind the science. They reminded us that we were not alone in our quest for justice, that behind every sample, every particle analyzed, there was a human being in a silence of absence that deserved to be honored. It was a profound lesson that led me to rethink how we communicated our conclusions. We could not fall into cold or overly technical language, but needed a narrative that conveyed the value of every detail as an act of respect for that person and for those seeking answers. With this purpose, we organized meetings where the multidisciplinary team explained the findings clearly, humanizing every step of the process and supporting the family in their struggle. This not only strengthened our conviction, but also made us more aware of the social impact of our role. I learned more than ever that the forensic expert is a guardian of memory, a facilitator of truth, and a necessary interlocutor between science, justice, and society. The conclusion, however, was still far off. Just when it seemed the investigation was in its final phase, leaked confidential documents revealed that the experimental substance was also linked to regulatory programs that, it became clear, had been incomplete or manipulated to benefit certain sectors. The connection between scientific research and political decisions became evident. This discovery caused an upheaval at the local and regional levels. It was not only a case of negligence or aggression, but a symptom of a system functioning with dark zones enabled to protect economic interests at the expense of human lives. We faced the reality that the weight of our work could extend far beyond a trial or isolated procedure. We held in our hands a possibility to open a path to strengthen controls so that what had remained invisible for so long could be prevented from happening again. The commitment was not only to the victim but to society as a whole. to future workers, to all people who deserve a safer and fairer environment. In each of those endless days in the lab and meetings with experts, I felt that forensic work became almost a sacred duty. It was preservation, judgment, denunciation, but also a source of hope. The tiniest evidence, that tiny particle others did not see or dismissed, had been our guide through a labyrinth of fog and silence. A hidden truth that disrupted lives, revealed complicities, challenged powers, and offered consolation. But beyond the shadows and noise, I learned that each of us in our task has the power to uncover secrets, restore dignity, and fight against oblivion. That patience, meticulous attention, and perseverance are not only the virtues of scientists, but acts of resistance against injustice. And today, as I share this story, I want it to be clear that the body does not lie, even if many want to ignore its signals. That justice does not always come quickly or without obstacles, but truth, however small it seems at first, has a force that can tear down walls. That forensic work is what sustains a balance between silence and shout, between death and memory. What began as a tiny fragment, found almost by chance, became the key to dismantling a complex and dangerous web. But even more importantly, it was a profound lesson in the value of not giving up, in ethical responsibility, and in the conviction that truth always deserves to be waited for. This experience marked me not only professionally, but also personally and humanly. It showed me that, even when the path is dark and fatigue weighs heavily, the commitment to justice and patience for every detail can transform the future. That small clue that no one considered becomes, in the hands of those who pay attention, the most powerful legacy we can leave. The truth that illuminates and justifies all hope. What was unfolding was, in every sense, a puzzle that challenged not only our professional capacity, but also our emotional strength. Each new piece of information took us deeper, almost as if we were peeling away layers of a story buried under years of omissions and silences that someone was determined to keep. But the truth, no matter how much one tries to hide it, has that powerful quality of imposing itself, filtering even through the smallest cracks, and we were beginning to find those fractures in the system. One afternoon, while reviewing reports and correlating data in the lab, an unmarked package arrived. It was discreet without labels, but its contents turned out to be a folder with photographs and internal documents that no one else had access to. These images showed areas of the plant where unauthorized workers were supposedly not allowed to go, but which evidenced unusual movements and handling of very sensitive materials. What struck me was not just the content, but the precision of those documents, the care with which they were organized, as if someone wanted them to reach our hands specifically. Something about the way those pieces of evidence were presented made me think that we were being accompanied, or at least that someone inside also wanted the truth to come to light. Reading those pages led me to discover that the supervisor we had pointed out had not only manipulated records, but had coordinated a series of covert actions to hide the origin and destination of that experimental substance. Names, dates, and places began to appear within a network that clearly exceeded the logic of a simple industrial plant. It was as if from above, at some hidden hierarchical level, a scheme had been designed to divert attention and keep any possibility of sanctions at bay. What surprised me most was that this scheme seemingly wove a network reaching other key sectors related to the regulation of hazardous chemicals, both nationally and regionally. The experimental substance we had analyzed was not just part of an ambitious and secret program, but had been used in tests whose results were manipulated so as not to reveal the real damage it caused. In that game of power, the lives put at risk seemed to be seen only as disposable variables. As we advanced in the investigation, I felt the risk escalate. It was not only data we were uncovering, but faces, names, and concrete responsibilities. Unofficial alerts started coming to us. We realized there were attempts to interfere with our work. Sometimes samples disappeared from the lab. Other times analyses that should have been prioritized were delayed, and on more than one occasion an uncomfortable silence filled the corridors, like an open warning shadow. But amidst all that pressure, something else grew stronger. The bond between us, the forensic team, became indisputable. We knew we depended on each other to maintain sanity and determination in an environment where physical and mental fatigue was constant. That was when I decided to open a more direct and closer channel with the victim's family, so they wouldn't feel we were working inside a bubble. I wanted them to understand that behind every report, every analysis, were their stories and their pain, and that, although answers wouldn't come quickly or easily, we were doing everything possible so that the justice they deserved would not remain empty words. During one of those meetings, I remembered a phrase a mentor told me years ago. The body holds not only the truth of its own, but also that of the world around it. That resonated strongly in my mind as I listened to the family recount simple moments, seemingly everyday details that, however, took on another dimension amid that tragedy. It was as if suddenly the lab also became a space of memory and humanity, reminding us that our work required sensitivity beyond the technical. Each new day brought different challenges. I often returned to the study of the particle, that test which, though minimal, had become the gateway to a whole hidden truth. We tried to better understand its behavior in the human body, its interaction with other chemicals, its metabolic routes, and how it caused damage so rapidly and silently. For this, we collaborated with toxicology and analytical chemistry specialists internationally, who contributed advanced techniques and new perspectives that help refine our interpretation. Gradually, these pieces showed that the outcome had not been accidental, nor a mere case of negligence. The particle and its components were deliberately designed to go unnoticed in routine analyses, yet were lethal in low doses and cumulative exposures. Faced with this, we had to think about the original plant protocols, which safety measures failed, and why those failures were not only ignored but concealed. It reflected a system working with dangerous cracks, where the drive for production or profit often eclipsed the most basic priority: protecting human life. The most unexpected turn came when, thanks to an old digital record recovered with the help of forensic computer experts, we discovered a chain of internal emails. In them, officials at different levels debated the convenience of keeping certain operations secret, and even considered obstructing or delaying investigations that could jeopardize important contracts with private companies. Some words were cryptic, but there was no doubt they were discussing protecting corporate interests and preventing the truth from reaching authorities or civil society. This brought us to a critical point because we were no longer facing a case of occupational exposure or an industrial accident, but a scenario of institutional corruption, where safety and life were subordinated to economic and political interests. In response, the team made a firm decision not to let insecurity and fear paralyze us. We decided to reinforce measures to protect the integrity of those involved in the investigation and ensure our work adhered to strict standards of transparency and ethics. Despite the pressures and shadows surrounding us, nothing could undermine the spirit that kept us united. There was in all of us a deep, almost instinctive conviction that this struggle mattered, not only for the victim, but for all people who might be at risk, either within the system or in similar situations. This responsibility was the engine pushing us not to give in, to review every detail again and again, to confront contradictions, and not to trust superficial explanations. There were also moments when the tension became palpable, especially when some figures linked to the case began publicly denying or attempting to discredit the forensic work. When that happens, misinformation becomes a powerful weapon that diverts attention and fuels confusion. However, our team's strength lay in basing our conclusions on verifiable and compelling evidence, leaving no room for vague interpretations or manipulation. Finally, the true scope of that tiny particle was exposed in reports that combined not only medical analyses, but also studies on the industrial, economic, and social context in which it had developed. We had managed not only to identify the root cause of the damage, but also to show how that damage was systematic and preventable, if there had been a will to investigate and correct it. It was, without a doubt, one of the most intense and enriching periods of my career. I learned that forensic work is not just about identifying causes of death or harm, but is an ethical commitment to society. Science, when united with courage and critical reflection, can be a transformative force. I also understood that the stories we tell from the lab go far beyond a file or a trial. Those stories can drive real-life changes that save future lives and dignify those who suffered. As we moved toward the formal closing of the investigation, I felt that small clue, that detail almost invisible to so many, had achieved something seemingly improbable, breaking down the wall of indifference and distrust that so often covers injustice. The evidence that at first seemed insignificant had become the beacon guiding everyone toward a truth that was necessary and urgent. In the final meeting with the team, a shared understanding filled the room. Our role did not end with delivering the final report. It went beyond that to implementing concrete actions so that this would not happen again. A plan was devised to strengthen safety measures at the plant, to make protocols transparent and auditable, and so that workers had effective channels to report without fear. We also promoted awareness campaigns about the importance of rigorous inspections and industrial responsibility, aiming to overturn the culture of impunity and negligence. Above all, the experience left me certain that although forensic work is silent and often invisible to society, it has a profound impact because it upholds justice and memory. That every body examined and every clue recorded is an act of resistance against oblivion and injustice. We learned once again that patience is not passivity, but the strength needed to wait for the right moment when the truth can shine, no matter how small the spark that lights it. So, as I close this story and share it, I think of that particle no one wanted to see, the patience no obstacle could break, and the courage of those who committed to looking beyond appearances. That is the greatest lesson I can convey, that justice, in the end, always finds its way when there are those who persevere to make it so, and that, in our work as forensic specialists, that path is built in every care for detail, every minute invested, every voice that refuses to be silenced. Because the truth, however small and hidden it may be, has the power not only to uncover what is concealed but to transform the world, so that we never forget the human dimension behind each case and never allow it to happen again. What came next was a disturbing mixture of certainties and doubts, a sea of questions where each answer seemed to open a door to an even greater mystery. We had proceeded cautiously, step by step, but the feeling that we were moving through a minefield remained ever present. It was not only the technical complexity that confronted us, but also the silent resistance we found in every corner. That evidence nobody wanted to consider, that almost invisible particle, had unleashed a chain of events that no one expected or was willing to face easily. The following weeks were marked by meticulous interdisciplinary analysis. In the laboratory, the atmosphere, charged with nerves and concentration, blended with accumulated fatigue. It was not a swift job, but one requiring extreme patience, because every mistake could mean losing the smallest clue and undermining the entire effort. We reviewed the reports repeatedly, exchanged hypotheses with specialists supporting us from abroad, and compared every finding with what we were discovering in the field. There was a very delicate moment when it was reported that some environmental monitoring devices at the plant had been tampered with. It was not simply sabotage, but a clear warning that someone was watching us, that there was an interest in controlling the narrative and hiding the truth at any cost. That realization put us on high alert. We knew the physical risk had escalated, but so had the conviction that if we gave in to fear, the entire investigation would be in vain. Meanwhile, communication with the victim's family became even more vital. In one of those meetings, the eldest sister recounted how her brother had mentioned, weeks before his accident, certain irregularities he had noticed at the plant, but had chosen to remain silent out of fear of retaliation. Those words resonated strongly with me. He was not just another victim in the statistics. He was someone who had tried to warn without being heard, trapped in a network that protected those in power. That testimony reminded us of the responsibility we had not only to science, but to the people behind the numbers. Meanwhile, the team began to construct a rigorous timeline, aligning movements recorded by internal cameras with leaked documents and forensic data. With each match, the judicial picture sharpened and revealed a carefully orchestrated plot. What initially seemed like a fortuitous accident was turning into a deliberate act, a web of systematic negligence and maneuvers to prevent any hint of transparent investigation. Understanding this network was not only key to justice, but also to preventing other workers from being exposed to invisible risks. An unexpected turn occurred when an anonymous source, contacted through a secure channel we had set up, provided internal audio recordings. In them, high-ranking officials discussed strategies to discredit forensic evidence and delay the publication of results. Although the documents were partial and the voices sometimes interrupted, the forcefulness of the content was enough to raise a major alarm. We knew we were facing a battle that went beyond science, now fought on political and media grounds, with implications that could even compromise the safety of those involved in the investigation. That reality further strained the bonds within the team. Everyone knew the weight of responsibility could become an unbearable burden if not supported by mutual trust. Protection strategies were reinforced. We exchanged codes and communications to avoid leaks, and established rotating shifts to ensure someone was always alert to any anomaly or threat. Beyond protocol, a spirit of solidarity was created that, faced with a threat, became the strongest shield. During one of the hardest days in the laboratory, I was surprised by a call from a toxicology colleague who had been reviewing the latest results. His voice, usually calm, sounded unsettled. He told me that a compound related to the particle had a synergistic effect with other substances present in the plant environment, and that together they could exponentially increase cellular damage, accelerating inflammatory and degenerative processes that until then had not been considered. It was a revelation that further complicated the picture, because it showed that exposure was not just an isolated accident, but an integral and shared risk affecting all workers without their knowledge. This news added an additional layer of urgency to our work. It was not only about identifying culprits and accurately determining the cause of death, but about warning and preventing, so that no one else would suffer the devastating effects of criminal negligence. There was therefore a dual challenge: to accelerate the complaint and make it visible to authorities, always maintaining scientific rigor to withstand attacks and manipulations, while also protecting the integrity of the team and the families involved. One night, while reviewing digital records again with a forensic IT expert, an anomaly in the metadata caught our attention. Some files had been modified days after the case became public, with altered versions seeking to minimize the impact of the particle. That was literally document falsification, a serious act that reinforced the hypothesis of a much broader and more powerful cover-up network than we had imagined. This discovery made us even more cautious and methodical because such manipulations could extend to other areas if we did not detect them in time. The days became a dizzying mix of internal and external pressures. On one hand, the anxious waits as new evidence arrived. On the other, news and the media distorting or minimizing the case, and also shadows that seemed to lurk in the offices and corridors of the Institute. But despite everything, every team meeting was a small refuge of commitment and hope. And it was like that little by little, we managed to assemble the final major piece, a comprehensive report that not only scientifically explained the injury caused by the particle, but also detailed the institutional network that had allowed it to happen. That report was a result of months of exhaustive work, a meticulous synthesis combining forensic science, chemical analysis, unprecedented internal documentation, and valuable testimonies. But more importantly, it included concrete recommendations to reform industrial protocols and ensure that a situation like this would never happen again. Everything was ready to be presented to the authorities and society, with the conviction that silence was no longer an option. Before finishing, I clearly remember the day we delivered the report. The room was full, not only members of the team, but also representatives of unions, oversight agencies, and some family members. The tension was palpable, but the atmosphere was charged with something much stronger: hope. As I spoke, I felt that all the difficulties, fears, and doubts dissolved before the strength of what we had achieved together. It was not just a report, but a call to action, a voice demanding justice and change. From that moment, the case took on another dimension. Reactions were diverse, ranging from disbelief to solidarity. But above all, it sparked intense public debate about industrial responsibility, workplace safety, and research ethics. There were resistances and obstacles, of course, but also a growing movement demanding transparency and protection for those who, like the victim, had no defense other than the firm voice of those who silently worked to bring the truth to light. Looking back, I realized that what seemed like just a routine finding became a turning point in my career and in the history of forensic justice in Montevideo. I learned that patience, sensitivity, and courage not only saved cases but entire lives, and that behind every particle, every cell examined, there is a story deserving to be heard and respected. And so, as I close this chapter, it is clear to me that truth, no matter how tiny and elusive it may seem, has extraordinary power to change the course of things. That every detail counts. That every minute spent seeking it is an investment in justice and memory. That our work, often invisible, is a flame that refuses to be extinguished, because true justice is not imposed. It is built with patience, rigor, and the deep certainty that in the end, truth always prevails. This case taught me that, deep down, Being a forensic expert is being a guardian of a fragile and powerful truth, one that protects those who can no longer raise their voice and challenges those who want to hide what must be seen. And although the past sometimes seems endless, that truth has the power to transform, to open new paths, and to remind us that the invisible deserves to be revealed so that one day justice may reach all its claims, no matter how small they seem. The atmosphere in the laboratory became almost palpable, as if the very air was charged with electricity, preparing us for what was to come. Every piece of information seemed to hold a different key, and yet only by putting them together was it possible to begin understanding the true scope of that tragic outcome. I remember once again going over the victim's body, now from the renewed perspective given to us by the evidence that no one wanted to see. That tiny particle, invisible in the initial analyses, was a crack through which the whole truth leaked. It was not easy to keep calm because, as the case progressed, we witnessed the increasing pressures. The obstacles no longer came solely from technical complexity, but from those who did not want the truth to come to light. In meetings that seemed routine, I could feel eyes boring into us with a mixture of suspicion and warning. The feeling of being watched was constant. We experienced the paradox of being in a closed space, equipped with cutting-edge technology, yet moving as if we were on a chessboard where every move could trigger an unexpected and dangerous play. That tension brought us closer together as a team. Amid so many doubts, trust became a fundamental pillar. I remember many long nights, sitting in a laboratory, surrounded by screens and paperwork, discussing every detail, every inconsistency. There were moments when fatigue seemed to want to overcome us, but we sent each other messages of encouragement, reminding ourselves that this was worth it, that people depended on us not stopping. In those moments, I understood once again that working in forensics means you are not alone. Behind every body is a complex network of lives and communities that deserve respect and justice. An unexpected event complicated the situation further. One of our key files mysteriously disappeared from the server. It was not just any file, but one containing data and graphs essential to understanding the chemical interaction between the particle and other compounds present in the plant. The loss was a direct blow that made us reconsider our cybersecurity measures and internal procedures. It did not take long for us to suspect that someone sought to destabilize us or prevent those data from reaching the authorities. What no one expected was that the sabotage was only the prelude to something much darker. Shortly after, one of the technicians working with us expressed concern, stating he had evidence that someone had also tried to hack his personal devices. This revealed that we were facing not only a scientific battle, but a power game willing to use any means to silence the investigation. It was at this stage that I realized how fragile we were when facing an environment protecting larger interests, where the truth was an invisible enemy with many allies. The intensity of the case also led us to scrutinize every internal communication related to the plant and the investigation. We found emails with ambiguous language, vague terms, and sometimes orders that seemed designed to leave no written trace. That lack of transparency was a shadow covering the entire scene, and each new email we opened increased the feeling that we were unraveling a very well-woven web. They were not only trying to hide the facts, but also to discredit any attempt to reveal them, doing so quietly, so it would seem merely a chain of bureaucratic errors. One particularly cold night, amid fatigue accumulated week after week, I received an unexpected visit from someone who preferred to remain in the shadows. He spoke in a low, measured voice, claiming to have information confirming the existence of secret meetings between plant executives and public officials, in which they planned not only to discredit the case, but also to pressure certain members of the investigation team to abandon the process. That confession shook me and made me understand that we were right at the center of a struggle far beyond a simple workplace accident. However, despite the implicit threats and constant pressure, our response was perseverance. We strengthened internal security protocols, organized regular meetings to share progress, and never let fear penetrate our decisions. The conviction that we were doing something that mattered beyond ourselves was what kept our flame alive. That is why every new piece of evidence confirming manipulation in the plant became a small victory, one more step toward the light we sought to kindle amid so much darkness. Collaboration with international experts intensified and gave rise to an unexpected turn in the investigation. An external laboratory detected, in environmental samples we had collected, traces of a substance previously unknown in that industrial context. That substance, a synthetic compound with specific corrosive properties, seemed to act as a catalyst for the harmful reaction caused by the particle. This revelation unleashed a new line of inquiry that demanded reviewing not only safety protocols, but also the very legislation regulating production and handling of materials in our work environment. Meanwhile, the victim's family remained our emotional priority. In multiple meetings, emotions fluctuated between hope and despair, between anger and the relief of feeling they were not alone in the pursuit of justice. I received letters and messages I never expected, profound stories from people who saw in our work a way to honor those who had lost their lives under similar circumstances. That human responsibility added a weight we could not ignore, but that at the same time gave us the strength to move forward, reminding us at every moment why every detail, no matter how small, had to be discovered and documented with precision. At the height of the tension, the presentation of the final report became a moment charged with deep symbolism. In that room, where so many voices participated, I noticed how, despite the diversity of interests, there was a tacit consensus on the need for change. As I spoke, I felt that every word had to be measured but also frank, that our conclusions could not be merely technical but a direct call to collective consciousness. There we stood, facing representatives from industry, justice, and the community, presenting not only facts but the lived reality of those who work silently, exposed to invisible risks and often ignored. But just as it seemed we were reaching a turning point, an explosive leak shook the scene. Internal documents, obtained clandestinely, revealed plans to systematically downplay the danger of certain substances and strategies to prevent regulators and inspectors from having real access to safety data. Those revelations caused a scandal that reached newspaper headlines and sparked conversations across all sectors. Media pressure was intense, and although some sought to discredit our work and motivations, the scientific community and workers began mobilizing, pushing for reforms and demands for transparency. That moment was a turning point not only for the case, but for how I understood my role as a forensic doctor. It was not a job confined to laboratories or limited to technical reports, but a window into a world where science becomes an act of service and courage. I learned that going beyond the visible, having the courage to question the established, and forging sincere alliances is what can truly change destinies. That case taught me that the truth can be minimal in size, almost imperceptible, but its impact can redraw entire realities. Closing that chapter, with the echo of the battles fought resonating in every corner of the Institute, I was left with a firm certainty that justice, to be true, must be grounded in integrity and perseverance. Silence is often complicit, and that is why our work must be a beacon, a shield, a defense of those who can no longer defend themselves, and a warning call for those who try to distort the facts. I never forget that particle no one wanted to consider, because it condensed the whole lesson, that in the smallest detail may lie the door to the truth, and that looking closely at that minutiae is an act of profound humanity and responsibility. That is the story I want to share because behind every report, every analysis, there are hours of invisible struggle, of broken silences, and lights igniting in the dark. Being a forensic expert means learning to listen to those silent voices, to see what others do not see, and to build with patience and conviction a bridge between death and justice, between oblivion and memory. Today I know that forgotten evidence was more than a finding. It was a call, a warning, and a hope. There is no truth too small to be discovered, nor battle too great to be faced, as long as there are those willing to seek it with soul and science united. Although the atmosphere seemed to have calmed after the media storm, the reality was much more complex than anyone could have anticipated. Just when we began to believe that we had reached the core of the problem, a series of inconsistencies in the testimonies of certain key employees sparked a new wave of distrust. It was not only the physical evidence that revealed secrets to us. Now words, silences, and evasions began to trace another map, an even more intricate one. That small particle that no one wanted to consider had unleashed a chain reaction that shook not only the scientific environment, but also the social and political spheres. In the following weeks, our team was forced to venture into territories where science seemed merely a tool amid a battle of power and manipulation. We discovered that some internal complaints had been systematically ignored, and that certain signs of risk had been minimized not out of ignorance, but convenience. A web of intertwined interests maintained the veil of opacity we sought to lift, and that fabric was not easy to unravel. It was then that I understood that the patience I spoke of at the beginning became a fundamental requirement, almost a form of resistance against a system that seemed designed to protect itself more than the people. I recall one particular early morning when we were reviewing a set of photographs taken during the plant inspection. I noticed something that had escaped my attention until then: minimal, almost imperceptible corrosion on a conduit near where the fatal particle had been found. It was not the kind of damage that usually draws attention in an industrial setting, but its presence coincided with the presence of the corrosive synthetic compound detected by international colleagues. That tiny corrosion was at the same time a silent marker of a prolonged chemical reaction, further evidence that the environment was being altered in ways that could affect not only the workers, but the entire community living nearby. This implied expanding the investigation to a much more ambitious and delicate level. We began collecting samples not only from the direct work area, but also from residential zones, nearby waters, and even the air breathed by families. Each analysis brought disturbing findings. The synthetic compound not only caused physical damage, but could also be linked to respiratory diseases and chronic ailments that until then had not been associated with the plant. It was a puzzle revealing a silent and cumulative harm, and the urgency to spread the word grew stronger. However, as the evidence accumulated, so too did the pressure to silence any attempt at denunciation. One day, while organizing a meeting with community representatives and health authorities, an anonymous message arrived. It was a warning. If we continued, the consequences would not only be professional. The news was not entirely surprising, but the harshness of the threat left me with an indescribable feeling, a mixture of adrenaline and responsibility settling into every muscle. I was not alone, of course, but I felt the weight of that commitment strongly. I knew that taking a step back would mean abandoning those who trusted us, and moving forward meant assuming risks that, on the surface, might seem disproportionate for a job that, after all, had to be scientific and objective. Our team reinforced not only physical and digital security measures, but also psychological support. We openly discussed fear, frustration, and that uncertainty that sometimes seemed to threaten to undermine our conviction. It was in that intimate dialogue that I understood that the true value of our work lay not only in science, but in the humanity we put into every step. We saw how even within the Institute, some colleagues doubted or preferred not to get involved, and that strengthened those of us who chose to continue. It was not a battle against any particular person, but against a system that preferred the comfort of ignorance and silence. The investigation took new turns, as surprising as they were worrying. Among the recovered files and cross-examined statements emerged a figure of an intermediary, someone who connected top executives with external officials, tasked with manipulating not only information but also public opinion. This contact maintained a network of influences ranging from media outlets to regulatory sectors, aiming to ensure that any scandal would become a passing sigh. We discovered that some official technical reports were actually modified or incomplete versions, hiding the true levels of exposure to toxic substances. This finding forced us to act with greater caution and determination. We decided to collaborate much more closely with investigative journalists, non-governmental organizations, and community leaders, creating a common front to break the isolation of information. I felt that this alliance was a turning point, a demonstration that there could and should be no rigid boundary between science, society, and justice. In moments like these, I understood that forensic work does not end in the laboratory. It extends into human territory, into defending those who need it most, into a struggle that, although discreet, is fundamental for breaking vicious cycles. The day the opening of judicial proceedings against the company and some officials was announced, a mixture of emotions enveloped us. We had achieved much. But we also knew that this stage was just the beginning of an even tougher battle, where the truth would have to withstand attempts at manipulation that would surely intensify. I took a moment to look at my team, young and experienced, tired but steadfast, and felt profound respect for each one. That case had gone from being a professional task to a shared cause that intimately united us, teaching us that behind every documentary evidence or chemical analysis there was a fabric of lives worthy of being defended to the end. However, I could not stop thinking about the initially discarded particle, how something so small had unleashed a storm that shook invisible foundations. That reflection made me realize that in our work, as in life, we must never underestimate what seems insignificant. Sometimes, the truth hides in tiny fragments, in details that appear irrelevant, but when observed with patience and determination, reveal hidden realities that can change everything. That was a great lesson the experience left me. Truth is not only a confirmed fact, but a constant act of attention, intuition, and courage. After months of struggle, investigations, sleepless nights, and veiled threats, a deep sense of purpose settled within me. Not because everything had ended, but because I knew we had managed to ignite a light no one could extinguish. That light was a certainty that, although the path to justice is long and often lonely, we must never stop searching, never resign ourselves to letting the truth be buried under layers of indifference and fear. In that commitment lay the most human and noble essence of our work. In the end, I understood that being a forensic doctor is much more than identifying causes of death. It is being a guardian of silent stories, a bridge between science and social conscience, and above all, maintaining a steady and clear gaze in the face of life's fragility and the tireless pursuit of justice. And perhaps, in that tiny forgotten particle, we've found much more than a forensic clue. We've found a symbol, a reminder that every small detail, no matter how invisible it seems, has the power to change realities, and that true justice begins when we dare look attentively at what many prefer to ignore.